Close your eyes and listen. Do you hear it? That's the sound of waves hammering against ancient stone, relentless and eternal. That's the cry of seabirds wheeling above cliffs that have watched civilizations rise and crumble. That's the creak of rope bridges swaying over churning waters, connecting towers that refuse to fall despite the sea's hunger. You're standing on the edge of the world, on islands where the soil yields nothing, and the people yield to no one. This is a place where children learn to swing an axe before they learn to write their names, where drowning is not death but rebirth, where a man's worth is measured not by the gold in his coffers, but by the blood on his blade, by what he has taken from those too weak to keep it. Tonight, we descend into the cold waters of history to explore the Iron Islands and the Old Way, a culture forged in salt and iron, sustained by blood and belief. To understand the Ironborn, you must first understand their home, for rarely has geography so completely shaped a people's identity and fate. The archipelago sits off the western coast of Westeros. These are not tropical paradises or temperate garden islands. The Iron Islands are harsh, unforgiving places where the wind never truly stops, where winter storms can last for weeks, where the very soil seems to resist cultivation. The largest island, Great Wick, stretches across its expanse with rocky shores and sparse forests. Old Wick, the second largest, holds the most ancient significance, for it was here that the first men supposedly first settled when they came to these islands thousands of years ago. Then there is Pike, smaller than Great Wick or Old Wick, but politically dominant as the seat of House Greyjoy. The castle of Pike itself stands as a monument to Ironborn stubbornness, built not on solid ground, but across a series of sea stacks, stone towers rising from the water and connected by rope bridges that sway sickeningly in the constant wind. To live in Pike is to hear the ocean constantly, to feel your home move beneath you, to know that one day the sea might claim these towers as it has already claimed parts of the older structures. The Greyjoys chose this location deliberately, building their seat of power in a place that required constant courage simply to inhabit. Harlaw lies to the northwest, the most fertile of the Iron Islands, though that designation is relative. Where other islands struggle to grow enough to feed their people, Harlaw manages thin harvests of barley and oats. The island is home to House Harlaw, readers and scholars by Ironborn standards, their keeps filled with books, a peculiarity that other islanders view with suspicion. 10 Towers, the seat of House Harlaw, stands as its name suggests, a sprawling complex of defensive structures overlooking the sea. Orkmont sits to the northeast of Pike, a wild and mountainous island where the old practices run deepest. Here, the transition from the old way has been slowest and most resisted. Great Wick, despite its size and population, has never held political dominance over the islands, perhaps because its very size prevents unified action, its various regions and houses pulling in different directions. Saltcliffe is smaller, poorer, its people among the most desperate of the Ironborn. When raiding was common, Saltcliffe men were known as the most vicious, for they had the least to lose and the most to gain. The island's very name speaks to its nature. Cliffs encrusted with salt spray, land that yields almost nothing, forcing its people to look to the sea. Everything. Finally, there is Blacktide, seat of House Blacktide, another smaller island contributing ships and men to the overall strength of the Iron Islands, but never achieving prominence. The black tides are unusual among Ironborn houses, producing lords who sometimes questioned the old way, who wondered if there might be a better path than endless raiding and violence. Beyond these 7 major islands, dozens of smaller isles and rocks dot the surrounding waters. Some have names, some have small populations of fisherfolk or shepherds, others are bare stone inhabited only by seabirds and seals. The waters between the islands are treacherous, filled with submerged rocks and unpredictable currents that only experienced Ironborn captains can navigate safely. The climate of the Iron Islands is as harsh as the landscape. Summers bring constant wind and rain. Winters transform the islands into frozen fortresses, lashed by storms that make sailing impossible for weeks at a time. Snow accumulates on the rocks. Ice forms in the harbours, and the people huddle in their keeps burning driftwood and peat, telling stories of summers past and raids successful. The soil of the Iron Islands is thin and rocky, poor for agriculture. What farms exist require backbreaking labour for meagre yields. Trees are scarce, mostly wind-bent and stunted, providing little timber. The islands have almost no valuable resources. There is some iron ore, giving the islands their name, but the deposits are limited and of poor quality compared to mainland mines. There is no gold, no silver, no precious gems hidden in the rocks. What the islands do have is access to the sea. Fish fill the waters, though fishing is hard and dangerous work. Seals beach on the rocks. Seabirds nest on the cliffs, their eggs providing protein when other food is scarce. And the sea provides something else, something that defined Ironborn culture for thousands of years: access to everywhere else. The geographical reality of the Iron Islands created an impossible situation. Too many people, too little land, too few resources. A traditional agricultural society could not sustain itself here. The islands could support a small population of fisherfolk living simple lives, but not the proud warrior culture that developed. Faced with this reality, the Ironborn made a choice. They would not beg the mainland for grain. They would not humble themselves as traders. They would take what they needed. This geographical determinism shaped everything about Ironborn culture. Their religion centered on the sea, on the drowned god who lived beneath the waves. Their economy was based on raiding, on the iron price. Their social structure elevated warriors above all others, for only through strength could they survive in such an inhospitable land. Their entire identity became wrapped up in defiance of their circumstances, in the refusal to accept the limitations their geography imposed. The Iron Islands stand as the physical manifestation of a philosophy, that a hard people can thrive in a hard land, that suffering builds strength, that the sea provides for those brave enough to take from it. Every Ironborn child grows up with salt spray in their face and stories of their ancestors' victories in their ears, learning that their islands may be poor in resources but rich in tradition, that they may have little but they bow to no one. And yet, this geographical isolation also meant vulnerability. The Iron Islands could raid the mainland, but they could never conquer it. They lacked the resources for prolonged campaigns, the population for occupying armies, the agricultural base to support extended wars. They were strong at sea, but weak on land. Their islands, while defensible, were also traps when enemies controlled the surrounding waters. Geography gave the Ironborn their identity, but also ensured their ultimate limitation. But geography alone does not explain the Ironborn. To truly understand the Iron Islands, you must understand the old way, for it is not simply a set of customs, but a complete worldview, a philosophy that governed every aspect of Ironborn life for thousands of years. The old way dictates that the Ironborn do not sow crops like farmers, do not build like craftsmen, do not trade like merchants. Instead, they reave. They take what they need from those too weak to defend it, paying the iron price with blood and courage. The old way's central tenet is expressed in House Greyjoy's words, "We do not sow." This is not merely a statement of fact, but a declaration of identity and superiority. Sowing is the work of thralls and weaklings, of men who till the soil and tend animals. The Ironborn are warriors, reavers, takers, not makers. A man who earns his wealth through farming or trade is despised as having paid the gold price, trading coin for what he wants like a merchant. But a man who takes what he needs in battle, who risks his life with blade and blood, has paid the iron price and earned respect. This philosophy extended to everything. An Ironborn warrior did not buy his armor. He took it from a man he killed. He did not purchase his wife. He captured her in a raid. He did not inherit his ship. He built it from timber taken from coastal villages or seized a vessel from enemies. Every possession had to be earned through strength, every comfort taken by force, every comfort taken by force, every advantage seized through violence. This was the iron price, and paying it was what made a man truly Ironborn. The old way recognized two types of wives, each reflecting different aspects of Ironborn values. A rock wife was a woman from the Iron Islands itself, married through traditional means, whose children would be legitimate heirs. She managed the household, held authority in her husband's absence, and was afforded respect and protection. But a salt wife was a woman captured during raids, taken from distant shores and brought back as a prize. A man could have only one rock wife but multiple salt wives, and the number of salt wives a man kept reflected his prowess as a reaver. Salt wives occupied a strange position in Ironborn society. They were not quite slaves, for they could not be sold, and their children, while not legitimate heirs, were still free. But they were not quite free either, for they had been taken by force and had no choice in their fate. The practice of taking salt wives was defended as part of the old way, as evidence of a warrior's strength and daring. A man with many salt wives had proven himself repeatedly, had survived many raids, had been successful enough to feed and house additional women. Thralls represented the bottom of Ironborn society, slaves taken in raids or born to slave mothers. The Ironborn practiced slavery openly, seeing no shame in it, as Westerosi of the Seven Kingdoms officially did. Thralls performed the degrading work that Ironborn warriors refused, farming the thin soil, tending the few animals, repairing buildings, rowing the longships when oarsmen were needed. Their lives were harsh, and their treatment often brutal, for compassion toward thralls was seen as weakness. The old way also governed leadership and power. A strong leader could rule, but only as long as he remained strong. The Ironborn had a tradition of kingsmoots, great gatherings where the men of the islands would choose their king. This was not democracy in any modern sense, for only certain men could be considered, and the choice was often influenced by threats and displays of force. But it was also not simple hereditary succession. A weak son could be passed over for a stronger uncle or cousin. A king who grew old and feeble could be replaced. Power had to be maintained through constant demonstration of strength. Raiding was the central activity of the old way, the means through which Ironborn acquired wealth and proved their worth. In the centuries before Aegon's conquest, Ironborn longships ranged far and wide. They raided up and down the western coast of Westeros, striking villages in the north and the Westerlands. They ventured as far as the Summer Isles to the south and the frozen shores of the Bay of Seals to the north. They even crossed the Sunset Sea to raid the distant coasts of Essos, bringing back exotic goods and captives. These raids followed a pattern refined over generations. Longships would approach a coastal settlement at dawn, when defenders were sleepy and unprepared. The Ironborn would beach their ships and attack with incredible ferocity, overwhelming any resistance through speed and violence. They would seize valuables, food, livestock, and people, load everything they could carry onto their ships, and depart before organized resistance could form. The key was speed. Strike hard, take what you can, leave before the enemy can mount a counterattack. But the old way was more than just raiding. It encompassed a complete moral framework that justified this violence. The Ironborn believed that the strong had a right to take from the weak, that this was the natural order of the world. The drowned god had made them superior to the soft men of the green lands, had given them the sea as their highway and their weapon. To raid was not immoral. It was fulfilling their divine purpose. To show mercy was weakness. The only virtues were courage, strength, and skill in battle. This worldview created a culture of extreme masculinity and violence. Boys were raised to be hard, taught to fight as soon as they could hold a weapon, encouraged to resolve disputes through combat. Weakness was not tolerated. A boy who showed fear or gentleness was mocked and punished, driven to either become hard or be broken. Those who could not adapt often died young, either in raids or through the cruelty of their peers. Women in the old way had more complex roles than simple victims or prizes. While Ironborn society was deeply patriarchal and women had fewer rights than men, there were also traditions of strong women. Asha Greyjoy, daughter of Balon Greyjoy, commanded men and ships, fighting in battles and participating in raids. While unusual, her presence was accepted because she proved herself capable by Ironborn standards, paying the iron price and demonstrating strength. The old way valued strength above all, and a woman who could prove her strength could earn respect, even if she could never fully escape the limitations of her gender. The old way also governed how disputes between Ironborn were resolved. While raiding outsiders was encouraged, killing fellow Ironborn was discouraged except in formal combat. When two men had a grievance, they could settle it through single combat, with the winner considered in the right by virtue of his victory. This preserves social cohesion, while still channeling the violent impulses of Ironborn culture into acceptable outlets. Religion and the old way were inseparable. The drowned god was not a distant deity to be worshipped on holy days. He was an active presence in Ironborn life, a god who demanded tribute in the form of raids and conquests, who rewarded the strong and drowned the weak. Every raid was an act of worship, every victory a prayer answered. The old way was, in essence, applied theology, the practical implementation of the drowned god's will as the Ironborn understood it. But the old way also contained the seeds of its own destruction. A society based entirely on taking from others is inherently limited by its victims' tolerance. As long as the Ironborn raided primitive tribes or scattered villages, they could sustain themselves. But when they faced organized kingdoms with professional armies and strong navies, the calculus changed. The iron price became too expensive when paid against foes who could exact a terrible cost in return. The old way worked in a world of scattered, weakly defended settlements. It failed against the unified Seven Kingdoms under Targaryen rule, against dragons and royal fleets. The Ironborn learned, painfully and repeatedly, that their traditional methods were obsolete, that the world had changed while they clung to ancient practices. But letting go of the old way meant letting go of their identity, meant admitting that their ancestors' path was a dead end, meant becoming like the soft Greenlanders they despised. This tension between tradition and necessity would define Ironborn history for centuries. Some embraced change, recognizing that the old way led only to defeat and decline. Others clung even more fiercely to tradition, seeing any accommodation with the mainland as betrayal. The old way became not just a way of life, but a political position, a marker of identity in debates about the Iron Islands' future. Yet the old way was never merely practical philosophy. If the old way provided the practical framework for Ironborn society, the worship of the drowned god supplied its spiritual foundation. The religion of the drowned god is as harsh and unforgiving as the islands themselves, a faith that demands strength, courage, and absolute acceptance of death by drowning as the gateway to eternal life. The drowned god is said to dwell in his watery halls beneath the sea, a realm of beauty and plenty where the drowned feast on fish and mate with mermaids, where summer never ends, and every warrior has his own perfect ship. This paradise awaits all true Ironborn who die by drowning, whether in battle at sea, in the drowning ceremony that marks their initiation into the faith, or simply lost to the waves while sailing. But those who die on land, whose bodies burn or rot without the sea's embrace, are denied entry to the drowned god's halls. This belief fundamentally shaped Ironborn attitudes toward death and the sea. Drowning was not something to fear, but something to embrace as the passage to eternal reward. The sea was not an enemy, but a pathway, both in life as the road to raiding, and in death as the god entrance to paradise. An Ironborn warrior who felt death approaching would sometimes cast himself into the sea deliberately, ensuring his passage to the watery halls, rather than risking death on dry land. Opposing the drowned god in Ironborn theology is the storm god, a malevolent deity who dwells in the sky and seeks to harm the Ironborn. When storms arise, it is the storm god attacking the drowned god's children. When ships sink in tempests, it is the storm god's doing. When lightning strikes and thunder roars, the storm god is raging. This dualistic cosmology gave the Ironborn a theological framework for the dangers they faced, transforming random weather into cosmic struggle. The priests of the drowned god are distinctive figures in Ironborn society. They dress simply in robes of mottled green, grey and blue, the colours of the sea. They go barefoot regardless of weather, believing that shoes separate them from the earth and water. They wear their hair long and unkempt, stained by salt water, and often adorned with seaweed and small shells. Around their necks, they wear small vials of seawater, ready at all times to perform blessings or drownings. These priests, called drowned men, have given themselves fully to their god through the drowning ceremony, though in their case, the drowning was not a brief ritual, but a prolonged ordeal. When a man becomes a priest, he is drowned and revived repeatedly, each time brought closer to death before being pulled back. This process continues until the priest has truly died and been brought back to life through the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation techniques the Ironborn have developed. Once truly drowned and revived, a man is considered dead to the world and reborn as a servant of the drowned god. The drowning ceremony itself is central to Ironborn faith. When a boy comes of age, when a warrior seeks blessing before battle, when someone wishes to demonstrate their faith, they undergo drowning. The priest leads the candidate into Set, the sea, often at high tide. As waves crash around them, the priest forces the candidate's head underwater, holding them down while intoning the ritual words. Let name your servant be born again from the sea, as you were. Bless him with salt, bless him with stone, bless him with steel. The candidate is held under until they stop struggling, until their lungs fill with seawater and their body goes limp. Only then does the priest drag them back to shore, laying them on the beach and pressing on their chest, forcing the water from their lungs. When they finally gasp and cough, spewing seawater, the priest declares, "What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger." This phrase, "What is dead may never die," serves as both prayer and greeting among the faithful Ironborn. The response is, "But rises again, harder and stronger," completing the ritual exchange. The words encapsulate the core belief of the faith, that death, specifically death by drowning, is not an end, but a transformation, making the believer stronger and preparing them for eternal life in the drowned god's halls. Not everyone survives the drowning ceremony. Some are held under too long, their lungs too damaged to recover. Others are revived but suffer brain damage from oxygen deprivation, becoming simple-minded or prone to seizures. The Ironborn view these deaths as the drowned god claiming his own, taking those chosen to feast in his halls immediately. The survivors, having faced death and returned, are considered blessed, truly born again from the sea. The faith of the drowned god has no grand temples like the faith of the Seven. Instead, worship takes place on beaches and rocky shores, wherever the sea meets the land. The natural cathedrals of the Ironborn are sea caves, where waves crash and echo, creating a sound like the voice of God himself. On Old Wick, there are ancient stone circles on the beaches, megaliths placed by the first men who first settled the islands, and these serve as particularly sacred sites where king's moots and other important gatherings are held. The priests of the drowned god are not an organized hierarchy like the faith of the Seven structure of septons, scepters, and the high septon. Each drowned man is essentially independent, wandering from island to island, performing ceremonies and blessings as needed. They live on the charity of the faithful, accepting food and shelter, but owning nothing beyond their robes and vials of seawater. This itinerant lifestyle keeps them in touch with common Ironborn, preventing the priesthood from becoming disconnected from the people. Religious observances in the drowned god's faith are simple and direct. Before undertaking any significant action, especially raiding or battle, an Ironborn will seek a priest's blessing. The priest pours seawater over the person's head while intoning prayers to the drowned god, asking for strength and safe passage. After returning from a successful raid, warriors will make offerings to the sea, casting valuable items into the waves as tribute to the god who granted them victory. The faith forbids certain practices. Cremation is anathema, for it denies the body to the sea and prevents passage to the watery halls. For this reason, Ironborn will go to great lengths to recover bodies of fallen comrades, preferring to cast them into the sea with weights rather than leave them to rot on land. The practice of taking trophies from enemies is encouraged, but desecrating bodies in certain ways is prohibited as offending the drowned god. Interestingly, the worship of the drowned god shows some flexibility regarding converts. Those not born Ironborn can adopt the faith and undergo the drowning ceremony. If they survive, they are considered as legitimate in the eyes of the drowned god as any native-born islander. This openness exists because the faith values strength and commitment over bloodline. A man who willingly faces drowning has proven himself worthy, regardless of his origin. The relationship between the drowned god and the old way is complex and mutually reinforcing. The old way's emphasis on raiding and taking the iron price is justified theologically as fulfilling the drowned god's will. The drowned god made the Ironborn superior to other men and gave them the sea as their weapon. So raiding is not merely practical, but divinely ordained. Conversely, success in raiding is interpreted as the drowned god's favor, proof that the old practices remain blessed. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where religious belief justified cultural practices and cultural success validated religious belief. When the Ironborn were successful in their raids, it proved the drowned god blessed the old way. When they failed, it meant they had strayed from the old practices and needed to return to tradition more fervently. This made the religion deeply conservative, resistant to change even when circumstances demanded adaptation. The worship of the Iti drowned god also served social functions beyond the purely spiritual. The drowning ceremony, with its real risk of death, served as an initiation rite that bonded those who survived it. They had shared an intense experience, faced death together, and emerged transformed. This created social cohesion among Ironborn warriors, a sense of brotherhood forged through shared ordeal. The faith's emphasis on strength and the acceptance of death also produced fearless warriors. Men who truly believed that drowning led to paradise had less fear of death at sea. They would take risks in naval combat that others would avoid, boarding enemy ships or fighting in storms because death held less terror. This religious fearlessness gave the Ironborn tactical advantages in naval warfare that more pragmatic sailors could not match. Yet the drowned god's faith also had limitations that would become increasingly apparent. It offered no comfort for those who questioned, no intellectual tradition for those who sought understanding beyond simple dogma. It provided certainty but not wisdom, courage but not innovation. As the world changed and the old way became increasingly untenable, the religion had no mechanisms for adapting, no theological flexibility to accommodate new realities. Some Ironborn, particularly those who spent time on the mainland or who read widely like the Harlaws, began to question whether the drowned god was truly the only path. They noted that the Seven seemed to provide just as well for their worshippers, that the old gods protected the north effectively, that perhaps divine favor was more complicated than simple dogma suggested. These doubts were dangerous to express openly, for questioning the drowned god was questioning the very foundation of Ironborn identity, the intertwining of faith and tradition, of the drowned god and the old way, found its political expression in the ruling house of the islands. The history of House Greyjoy is relatively recent compared to some of the ancient houses of Westeros, yet they have ruled the Iron Islands for centuries. Their kraken sigil flying from the towers of Pike and their authority, when they can maintain it, extending across all 7 major islands. Understanding the Greyjoys is essential to understanding the modern Iron Islands, for the family embodies both the old traditions and the conflicts that threaten to tear Ironborn society apart. House Greyjoy rose to power after the extinction of House Hoare, which had ruled the Iron Islands for generations. The Hoares were perhaps the most successful Ironborn dynasty, expanding their power far beyond the islands themselves. Under King Harwin Hardhand, the Ironborn conquered the Riverlands, creating a kingdom that stretched from the Iron Islands to Harrenhal. His son, Harren the Black, built the massive castle of Harrenhal, the largest fortress in Westeros, using Riverland's resources and forced labor. But Harren's ambition exceeded his wisdom. When Aegon Targaryen landed in Westeros with his dragons, Harren refused to submit. He retreated to his massive castle, believing its thick walls would protect him from dragonfire. He was catastrophically wrong. Balerion the Black Dread flew over Harrenhal and roasted everyone inside, ending House Hoare in a single terrible night. The melted stone of Harrenhal's towers still stand as a monument to the folly of defying dragons. With House Hoare extinct, the Iron Islands needed new leadership. Aegon allowed the Ironborn to choose their own lord, and they selected House Greyjoy of Pike. This choice was pragmatic rather than based on ancient right. The Greyjoys were strong enough to maintain order, but not so powerful as to threaten renewed rebellion against the Iron Throne. They understood that the world had changed, that dragons had ended the era when the Ironborn could raid and conquer with impunity. The early Greyjoy lords walked a difficult line. They needed to maintain the respect of their fellow Ironborn by honoring tradition and the old way, but they also needed to keep the peace with the Iron Throne and avoid provoking retaliation. This required political skill and a willingness to compromise that some viewed as weakness. The tension between these competing demands would define Greyjoy rule for centuries. The family's words, "We do not so," declared their commitment to the old way, even as their actions often contradicted those words. Greyjoy lords built trade relationships, collected taxes rather than relying solely on raiding, and generally administered the islands more like mainland lords than traditional Ironborn reavers. This pragmatic approach kept the peace and prevented disasters, but it also created resentment among those who saw the Greyjoys as having betrayed their heritage. The sigil of House Greyjoy, a golden kraken on a black field, carries its own symbolism. The kraken is a legendary sea creature, said to dwell in the deepest oceans, large enough to drag entire ships beneath the waves. Some Meisters dismiss krakens as sailors' tales, exaggerations of encounters with large squid. But the Ironborn insist they are real, and the kraken serves as a perfect representation of Greyjoy aspirations. A creature of the deep, powerful and terrible, rising from the depths to strike fear into all who sail. Balon Greyjoy, who ruled during the events of the main series, embodied the contradictions of his house and his people. He grew up during a period when the Iron Islands were relatively peaceful and integrated into the Seven Kingdoms. Trade brought some prosperity. The old raids had largely ceased, but Balon saw this peace as weakness, a betrayal of everything the Ironborn should be. He believed the old way needed to be restored, that the Iron Islands should return to their heritage of raiding and conquest. Balon's first attempt to restore Ironborn glory was Greyjoy's rebellion, which we will discuss in detail later. The short version is that he declared independence from the Iron Throne, crowned himself king of the Iron Islands, and launched raids on the mainland. The rebellion was crushed utterly, his fleet destroyed, his castles besieged. Balon was forced to bend the knee and give up his youngest son Theon as a hostage to ensure future good behavior. The defeat should have taught Balon that the old way could not succeed against the unified might of the Seven Kingdoms. Instead, it made him bitter and resentful. He spent years rebuilding his fleet, preparing for another chance to strike. When the War of the Five Kings broke out and the Seven Kingdoms tore themselves apart, Balon saw his opportunity. Rather than ally with Robb Stark, who offered partnership or support the throne, Balon launched raids on the north, seizing coastal castles and declaring himself king once again. This decision revealed both Balon's strategic limitations and his absolute commitment to the old way. Allying with Robb Stark would have been the smart political move, potentially securing Ironborn independence through cooperation. But Balon could not accept being anyone's subordinate or partner. The old way dictated that what you wanted must be taken, not given as part of an alliance. So Balon raided the north, earning the Ironborn nothing but a weakened position when the wars ended. Balon's children represented different possible futures for the Iron Islands. Rodrik, his eldest son, died young in Greyjoy's rebellion, embodying the traditional warrior ideal. Maron, another son, also died in the rebellion. These deaths should have broken Balon, but instead they hardened his determination, making him more committed to the path that had killed his sons. Asha, Balon's daughter, was perhaps the most interesting of his children. Raised more like a son than a daughter, she became a capable captain and warrior, commanding men and ships with skill. She represented a possible evolution of Ironborn culture, proving that adherence to tradition did not require rigid gender roles. That strength could be valued regardless of who demonstrated it. But she also recognized, more clearly than her father, that the old way in its pure form was unsustainable, that the Iron Islands needed to adapt to survive. Theon, Balon's youngest son, and only surviving male heir, was sent to Winterfell as a hostage at age 10. He grew up among the Starks, learning mainland ways, becoming more northerner than Ironborn. When he returned to the Iron Islands as a young man, he found himself caught between two identities. The Ironborn saw him as soft, corrupted by years among Greenlanders. But he could never truly be a northerner either, always marked as the Greyjoy hostage. This identity crisis led Theon to make terrible choices, trying to prove himself Ironborn by seizing Winterfell and betraying the Starks who had raised him. The family dynamics of the Greyjoys reflected the larger tensions in Ironborn society. Balon's inflexibility, his absolute commitment to tradition regardless of consequences, represented one extreme. Asha's pragmatism and willingness to adapt represented another. Theon's confused searching for identity represented the younger generation, caught between the old ways and new realities, trying to find a path that honored their heritage without destroying their future. The Greyjoys' relationship with the other major houses of the Iron Islands reflected these complexities. House Harlaw of Harlaw, led by Rodrik Harlaw, called the Reader, represented a more intellectual tradition, valuing books and knowledge in addition to martial prowess. Balon viewed this with suspicion, seeing it as weakness, but Rodrik Harlaw commanded enough respect through his own accomplishments that he could not be dismissed. House Goodbrother, House Drum, with their Valyrian steel sword, Red Rain, House Botley, these and other houses all had their own traditions and ambitions, sometimes supporting the Greyjoys, sometimes plotting against them. The Seastone Chair, upon which the Lord of the Iron Islands sits, carried its own significance for the Greyjoys. This ancient seat, carved from a single piece of strange black stone that seems to absorb light, supposedly predates the first men. Some say it was made by the Deep Ones, the legendary fish people said to have lived in the oceans in the Dawn Age. Others claim it came from the Shadowlands, beyond Ashai. Regardless of its origins, sitting in the sea stone chair conferred legitimacy on Greyjoy rule, connecting them to the most ancient traditions of the islands. The Greyjoys' relationship with their own heritage was complicated by the reality that they were not the most ancient or prestigious house in the islands. House Goodbrother claims descent from the Grey King, the legendary first king of the Iron Islands, who supposedly ruled for 1,000 years and took a mermaid as his wife. House Greyiron and others have equally ancient lineages. The Greyjoys were chosen to rule not because of ancient right, but because of practical politics, and this made their position more precarious, requiring constant reinforcement through displays of strength and commitment to tradition. Balon's death, falling from a rope bridge at Pike during a storm, led to the calling of the first Kingsmoot in thousands of years. This gathering would determine not just who ruled the Iron Islands, but what direction the islands would take, deeper into the old way or towards some accommodation with the modern world. The Greyjoy legacy, for all Balon's efforts to restore traditional glory, remained as conflicted and contradictory as ever. Understanding the Greyjoys means understanding how they ruled and what they ruled over. To truly grasp the Iron Islands, we must look beyond politics and warfare to examine the daily lives of the Ironborn, the social structures that organize their society, and the values that define their culture. This is a world where strength is the ultimate virtue, where the sea governs all aspects of life, and where tradition holds power that no king can fully command. Ironborn society is rigidly hierarchical, but with unusual pathways for advancement. At the top are the lords and captains, those who command ships and men. Below them are the common warriors, the reavers who man the longships and fight in raids. Below them are the small folk who fish and farm and maintain the infrastructure of life. At the bottom are the thralls, slaves who do the labor that no free Ironborn would demean themselves to perform. But this hierarchy is not completely fixed. A common warrior who proves himself exceptionally skilled and brave can rise to captain a ship. A captain who gathers enough followers can claim lordship over a keep and lands. The Ironborn respect strength and success above bloodline, at least in theory. In practice, established houses maintain their power through centuries of accumulated wealth and alliances. But the possibility of the advancement through prowess exists in ways that more rigid feudal societies do not allow. The nuclear unit of Ironborn society is not the individual or the nuclear family, but the ship's crew. A longship might have 30 to 50 men, and these men live together, fight together, share plunder and glory together. They develop bonds stronger than many blood relationships. A captain is judged not just by his own prowess, but by his ability to lead his crew, to inspire loyalty, to distribute plunder fairly. A crew that trusts its captain will follow him into impossible situations. A crew that doubts will mutiny or simply drift away when opportunities arise. Marriage customs among the Ironborn reflect both their raiding culture and certain practical realities. As mentioned earlier, there are two types of wives: rock wives and salt wives. A rock wife is a woman from the Iron Islands, married in a formal ceremony before witnesses and priests of the drowned god. Her children are legitimate and can inherit. She is the lady of the house, managing the household and lands while her husband is at sea. In many ways, rock wives have more practical power than women in mainland Westeros, for they must be capable of making decisions and managing affairs in their husbands' prolonged absences. Salt wives are women captured during raids, taken from coastal villages and distant lands. A man can have multiple salt wives, and while their children are not legitimate heirs, they are still free and still Ironborn. The practice is defended as part of the old way, as proof of a warrior's prowess, but it also represents one of the darker aspects of Ironborn culture, institutionalized kidnapping and forced marriage that the culture refuses to acknowledge as wrong. Some salt wives adapt to their new lives, making the best of their situation. Others never accept their captivity, remaining bitter and resentful. The Ironborn do not seem to concern themselves much with which category a salt wife falls into, viewing her feelings as irrelevant. What matters is that she was taken fairly, paid for with the iron price, and therefore belongs to her captor. Children are raised hard in the Iron Islands. Boys begin training with weapons as soon as they can hold them, usually by age 5 or 6. They learn to sail almost as early, for every Ironborn must be comfortable on the water. Swimming is taught young, often through the brutal method of simply throwing children into the sea and expecting them to figure it out. Those who cannot adapt, who show weakness or fear, are mocked mercilessly until they either toughen up or break. Girls receive different upbringing, taught household management and the skills needed to run a keep while husbands are away. But some girls, like Asha Greyjoy, are raised more like boys, learning to fight and sail. This is unusual, but not unheard of. And when a woman proves herself capable, she can earn a place in Ironborn warrior culture. The key is proving herself, demonstrating strength and skill that compels respect. Education in the Iron Islands is limited compared to the mainland. Maesters serve in the major keeps, teaching the Lord's children to read and write. But most common Ironborn are illiterate. Knowledge is passed down orally through songs and stories, tales of great reavers and legendary raids. The Ironborn value practical skills, seamanship and weaponcraft over book learning. House Harlaw is an exception, with their tradition of reading and maintaining libraries, but other houses view this as eccentric at best. The economy of the Iron Islands is unusual, based partly on fishing and limited farming, but historically supplemented heavily by raiding. When raiding was common, returning ships would bring back treasure, slaves, food, all the things the islands could not produce themselves. This created a boom and bust economy, where successful raiding seasons brought prosperity, but lean years could mean starvation. In more recent times, as raiding became less feasible, the Iron Islands developed more conventional economic activities. Trade, fishing, limited mining of their poor iron deposits. Some Ironborn became merchants, though they are looked down upon as having abandoned the old way. This transition was never complete, and the Ironborn economy remained stunted compared to the mainland, unable to fully embrace trade while still honoring traditions that despise it. Food in the Iron Islands is simple and often scarce. Fish is the staple protein, supplemented by seabirds and their eggs. Seals are hunted for meat and oil. The thin soil produces some barley and oats, enough for dark bread and thin porridge. Vegetables are rare. Meat from sheep and goats is occasional, cattle rare. In winter, stored fish and hardtack are often all that stand between the people and starvation. Drink is another matter. The Ironborn brew a dark, strong ale and have access to wine through trade or raids. Drinking is a central social activity, with warriors gathering in halls to drink and boast of their exploits. A man's ability to hold his liquor is seen as a measure of his strength. Stories are told, songs sung, and reputations built or destroyed based on behavior in the hall. Music and entertainment in the Iron Islands revolves around the sea and war. Songs tell of legendary raids, of heroes who paid the iron price and won glory, of ships that sailed to distant lands and returned rich with plunder. Bards are respected for preserving these stories, keeping alive the memory of great deeds. There is little of the courtly love songs popular in southern Westeros, little poetry about flowers or gentle romance. Ironborn songs are about blood and salt and victory. Religious observance is woven into daily life. Sailors pour seawater on their ships before voyages, asking the drowned god's blessing. Warriors touch seawater to their foreheads before battle. The phrase, "What is dead may never die," serves as greeting, prayer, and promise all at once. The sea is ever present, its sound constant, and the God who dwells beneath it is never far from Ironborn thoughts. Justice in the Iron Islands follows rough but clear customs. Disputes between Ironborn can be settled through combat if both parties agree. A man wronged has the right to challenge his offender. The victor is considered to have been in the right, vindicated by strength. More serious crimes, those that threaten the stability of society, are judged by the Lord. Murder of fellow Ironborn, betrayal, cowardice in battle. These can result in execution or exile. Slavery exists openly, a practice the rest of Westeros officially abhors, but the Ironborn embrace. Thralls are property, bought and sold, used for labor, and sometimes abused terribly. The Ironborn see no contradiction between their own fierce independence and their keeping of slaves. They are strong enough to take thralls. The thralls are weak enough to be taken. This is simply the natural order. Old age is viewed with mixed feelings in Ironborn culture. An old warrior who has survived countless battles, who can tell stories of legendary raids, earns respect for his experience and cunning. But an old man who has grown weak, who can no longer fight or contribute, may be seen as a burden. There is no tradition of comfortable retirement among the Ironborn. A man fights until he dies, or he goes to sea one last time and does not return. Women who survive to old age, particularly rock wives who have managed households and raised children while their husbands were at sea, often wield considerable informal power. They are repositories of knowledge about running keeps, about dealing with the practical realities of life. Young wives and women seek their counsel. Lords, even proud reavers, often defer to their mothers or elder female relatives in matters of household management. The culture produces a distinct personality type: proud, hard, often cruel, but also genuinely brave and loyal to those they consider their own. An Ironborn warrior is not gentle or sophisticated, but he is reliable in battle, unflinching in danger, and committed to his crew and his captain. These are not people you would want as enemies, but they make formidable allies if you can earn their respect. This culture, for all its harshness, creates strong social bonds. The shared hardship of life in the Iron Islands, the common faith, the collective memory of legendary ancestors, all bind the Ironborn together. They may fight among themselves, squabbling over status and plunder, but they share an identity that separates them from all mainlanders. They are Ironborn, children of the sea, followers of the drowned god, and they bow to no one. Yet none of this identity would exist without the ships that make it possible. If the Iron Islands are defined by anything, it is by vessels and the seas they traverse. The Ironborn are not merely sailors. They are a people whose entire culture revolves around their relationship with ships and the waters they cross. Understanding Ironborn ships is understanding Ironborn power, for without their longships, they would be simply poor islanders of no consequence. The Ironborn longship is a masterpiece of practical design, evolved over thousands of years of raiding and refined through trial and error written in blood and salt water. Unlike the great war galleys of the Royal Fleet, with their 3 or 4 decks and hundreds of oarsmen, a longship is sleek and relatively small, perhaps 60 to 80 feet long, built for speed and maneuverability rather than head-to-head combat. The hull is clinker-built, with overlapping planks that provide both flexibility and strength, allowing the ship to flex with the waves rather than fighting against them. This construction method also makes the ships easier to repair, crucial when operating far from proper shipyards. The wood is typically pine or oak, taken from coastal forests on the mainland since the Iron Islands themselves lack sufficient timber. A longship sits low in the water, drawing only a few feet when fully loaded. This shallow draft allows them to navigate rivers and reach beaches where deeper vessels cannot go, giving the Ironborn access to targets that other naval forces cannot reach. A longship can beach itself directly, running up onto sand or shingle, allowing warriors to disembark immediately rather than needing to anchor offshore and row to land in smaller boats. Propulsion comes from both oars and sail. The longship has rowing benches, typically 15 to 25 on each side, allowing 30 to 50 oarsmen to power the vessel. When the wind is favorable, a single square sail can be raised, woven from wool and often decorated with the sigil or colors of the ship's captain. The combination of oars and sail gives the longship flexibility, able to move in calm weather or against the wind through rowing, able to cover great distances quickly when wind cooperates. The crew of a longship serves dual purpose. When rowing, they are simply oarsmen, but when battle comes, they are warriors. There is no separation between sailors and fighters aboard an Ironborn ship. Every man must be capable of both rowing and fighting, of handling the ship in rough seas and then boarding an enemy vessel with axe and blade. This dual role is central to Ironborn warfare tactics. Longships are not designed for sustained combat against larger vessels. They lack the multiple decks, the archery platforms, the rams that characterize proper war galleys. What they have instead is speed and agility. An Ironborn longship can outrun almost anything larger and outmaneuver anything its own size. The tactic is not to engage in grappling matches with war galleys, but to raid, strike, and escape before enemy reinforcements arrive. For attacking merchant vessels or fishing boats, the longship is perfect. They appear suddenly, moving quickly even in light wind, through coordinated rowing. They close before the prey can escape, warriors boarding with grappling hooks and ropes. The raid is brutal and fast. Valuables are taken, captives secured, and the longship is gone before local forces can respond. This hit-and-run approach defined Ironborn raiding for centuries. Navigation is accomplished through a combination of coastline following, celestial navigation, and accumulated experience. The Ironborn are expert at reading the sea, interpreting wave patterns, bird behavior, and subtle color changes in the water to determine location and depth. They can navigate in fog and at night, using techniques passed down through generations. An experienced captain can find his way to a specific beach in total darkness, recognizing the shape of waves against rocks and the smell of the shore. The Ironborn also developed impressive skill in ship-to-ship combat when necessary. Their tactic is to come alongside an enemy vessel, throw grappling hooks to bind the two ships together, then board in overwhelming numbers. The first warriors across fight to secure the enemy deck, while others follow. The key is speed and ferocity, overwhelming defenders before they can organize resistance. Once the deck is taken, the enemy ship is either claimed as a prize or burned. Fire is both weapon and terror in naval combat. The Ironborn use fire arrows and burning pitch to set enemy ships ablaze. A wooden vessel, once burning, is doomed unless the fire can be immediately controlled. The Ironborn also use fire as a terror tactic, setting multiple ships ablaze during night raids on harbors, creating panic and confusion while they raid the shore. But fire is also the Ironborn's great weakness. Their ships are wooden, coated in tar and pitch, filled with rope and sailcloth, all highly flammable. An enemy with fire arrows or wildfire can destroy an Ironborn fleet if they can catch it at anchor or in confined waters. This vulnerability was exploited during Greyjoy's rebellion when the royal fleet used fire to devastating effect. The Ironborn also understood the value of surprise and the importance of intelligence. Before major raids, they would send out scouts in single ships to gather information about targets, defenses, patrol patterns. This intelligence allowed them to strike when and where defenders were weakest, maximizing success while minimizing casualties. A well-planned raid could net tremendous plunder with minimal losses. Storms presented both danger and opportunity. Ironborn ships, built to handle rough seas, could often sail in conditions that would beach or sink other vessels. This allowed them to launch raids during weather that kept defensive fleets in harbor. Many of the most legendary raids happened during storms, with Ironborn captains using the weather as cover for approaches that would be impossible in clear conditions. Maintenance of ships was constant work. Wood rots in salt water, rigging wears out, sails tear. Every Ironborn learned basic ship repair, and crews spent considerable time maintaining their vessels. In winter, when sailing was impossible, ships were pulled onto beaches and thoroughly overhauled. Damaged planks replaced, hulls recaulked, new rope made. The survival of the ship meant the survival of the crew, so this work was taken seriously. The naming of ships among the Ironborn reflected their values and their relationship with the sea. Names like Sea Bitch, Great Kraken, Grey Ghost, Night Flyer evoked either the sea itself, legendary creatures, or qualities valued in warfare. A ship's name was important, becoming part of its identity. Songs telling of famous ships and their captains' exploits. Building a ship was a significant undertaking, requiring substantial timber, skilled shipwrights, and months of labor. Traditionally, the iron price dictated that a man should take his ship from enemies rather than building one, but this was impractical for maintaining a fleet. Most ships were built on the islands, though the timber was often acquired through raids on coastal forests. Some particularly ambitious captains would raid shipyards themselves, stealing vessels already built. The largest Ironborn vessels were not longships, but true war galleys, built for sea battles rather than raiding. These ships could go toe-to-toe with Royal Fleet vessels, carrying archers and marines equipped with rams. But they lacked the versatility of longships, unable to navigate rivers or beach themselves, and the Ironborn generally preferred their traditional design. The war galleys were for defending the islands or engaging enemy fleets in open water, not for raiding. In the end, the longship represents everything the Ironborn are, adapted to their environment, designed for a specific way of life, effective within their niche, but limited outside it. Just as the Ironborn could not thrive on the mainland with its different rules and resources, their ships could not compete with purpose-built war galleys in traditional naval combat. But for raiding, for hit-and-run warfare, for projecting power from a weak resource base, the longship was perfect. The Ironborn relationship with their ships went beyond mere utility. A ship was freedom, the means to escape the barren rocks of the Iron Islands and find fortune elsewhere. A ship was power, the tool that let a man with courage and skill become wealthy. A ship was identity, defining who a man was and what he was capable of achieving. To be an Ironborn was to be a sailor, and to sail was to live the old way, following the path of ancestors across the eternal sea. The importance of ships to Ironborn identity became painfully clear in the events that would shake the islands to their foundations. No event in recent Ironborn history better illustrates the conflict between tradition and reality than Greyjoy's rebellion, the failed uprising led by Balon Greyjoy that ended in crushing defeat and shaped Iron Islands politics for a generation. This rebellion was not merely a political miscalculation, but a fundamental collision between the old way and the modern Seven Kingdoms. The seeds of rebellion were planted years before the actual uprising. Balon Greyjoy, like many Ironborn of his generation, grew up hearing stories of the glory days when the Iron Islands commanded respect through fear, when longships raided with impunity and brought back wealth from all corners of the known world. But the reality of his time was different. The Iron Islands were peaceful, integrated into the Seven Kingdoms. Their raiding days ended. The old traditions were fading, replaced by trade and farming. Balon saw this as degradation, a betrayal of everything the Ironborn should be. He believed that the old way needed to be restored, that the Iron Islands should return to independence and resume raiding. His thinking was influenced by both genuine belief in Ironborn superiority and practical politics. A successful rebellion would cement his position as not just Lord of the Iron Islands, but King of the Iron Islands, transforming him from one lord among many into a monarch in his own right. The timing of the rebellion was significant. Robert Baratheon had recently taken the Iron Throne after his rebellion against the Targaryens. The realm had been through years of war. Many great houses were weakened. Balon calculated that this was the moment to strike, while the kingdoms were still recovering, before Robert could consolidate his power. It was not an irrational calculation, but it underestimated Robert's determination and the loyalty he commanded from other regions. Balon declared himself king of the Iron Islands and Salt and Rock, claiming independence from the Iron Throne. He had spent years rebuilding the Ironborn fleet, preparing for this moment. His lords and captains mostly supported him, either because they believed in the cause or because refusing their liege lord was dangerous. The Sa rebellion began with raids on the mainland, attacks on coastal settlements in the Westerlands and the north. Classic Ironborn reaving designed to gather plunder and demonstrate power. Initially, these raids were successful. Coastal villages were sacked, ships captured, plunder taken back to the islands. The Ironborn fought with all the skill and ferocity their culture had bred into them. For a brief moment, it seemed like the old way might triumph, that the Ironborn could re-establish themselves as a power to be feared. But then the Iron Throne's response came, and it was overwhelming. Robert Baratheon, working with Eddard Stark and other great lords, assembled a massive force. The royal fleet, far larger and better equipped than the Ironborn navy, sailed for the Iron Islands. Ground forces prepared to invade. The full military might of the Seven Kingdoms focused on crushing the rebellion. The naval battle was decisive and devastating. The royal fleet, with its war galleys and experienced commanders, faced the Ironborn longships in open water. Exactly the kind of combat where the longships' advantages disappeared and their weaknesses became fatal. The Ironborn fought bravely, but courage could not overcome the fundamental disparity in ships and numbers. The royal fleet destroyed the Ironborn navy, sending dozens of longships to the bottom and scattering the survivors. With naval superiority established, the royal forces invaded the Iron Islands themselves. They landed troops on the shores, besieged the castles, and methodically reduced Ironborn resistance. The defenders fought hard, but they were trapped on their islands with no way to escape and no reinforcements coming. One by one, the major keeps fell or surrendered. The siege of Pike became the symbolic endpoint of the rebellion. The ancient seat of House Greyjoy, built across its sea stacks with waves crashing below, held out longer than most strongholds. But eventually, even Pike's walls were breached. Robert Baratheon himself took part in the assault, fighting alongside Eddard Stark and Thoros of Myr, who was the first through the breach. The fall of Pike ended any hope of continued resistance. Balon was forced to kneel before Robert and surrender unconditionally. Many of his captains were executed or took the black, sent to the Night's Watch. Balon's sons Roderick and Maron died during the fighting, killed in battle or during the sieges. The price of rebellion had been catastrophic, paid in Ironborn blood and broken ships. As a condition of peace, Balon had to give up his youngest son Theon as a hostage, a ward to be raised in Winterfell under Eddard Stark's supervision. This was both insurance against future rebellion and punishment, separating Balon from his heir, forcing the boy to grow up among the very people the Ironborn had tried to fight. Theon was 10 years old when taken, young enough to be shaped by his new environment, but old enough to remember his home and family. The aftermath of the rebellion was complex. Officially, it ended in complete defeat for the Ironborn. Their fleet was destroyed, their castles damaged, their prestige shattered. The old way had been tested against modern reality and found utterly wanting. The rebellion proved that the Iron Islands could not stand alone against the Seven Kingdoms, that the era of Ironborn independence was permanently over. But the rebellion also had subtle effects that strengthened traditional forces in Ironborn culture. Those who had argued for accommodation with the mainland, for focusing on trade and peaceful integration, were discredited. They had said the old way was dead, and Balon had tried to prove them wrong. He failed militarily, but in the eyes of many Ironborn, he had at least tried. He had refused to accept subjugation meekly. This earned him a certain respect even in defeat. Balon himself emerged from the rebellion even more committed to the old way than before. Rather than learning from his defeat, he internalized it as a temporary setback, a failure of execution rather than concept. He spent the years after the rebellion rebuilding his fleet again, quietly preparing for another opportunity. The defeat had taught him caution, but not acceptance of the mainland's dominance. For the Ironborn people, the rebellion reinforced their sense of separate identity. They had fought the Seven Kingdoms and lost, but they had fought. They had asserted their independence even if they could not maintain it. The memory of the rebellion became another story in the long history of Ironborn resistance to mainland authority, another example of their refusal to fully submit. The rebellion also highlighted the fundamental problem facing the Iron Islands. They were too weak to be independent, but too proud to fully integrate, too attached to the old way to embrace peaceful trade and farming, but not powerful enough to sustain themselves through raiding. Caught between past and present, between tradition and necessity, the Ironborn had no clear path forward. When the War of the Five Kings began years later, Balon saw another chance. This time, he was more cautious, waiting to see how the war developed before committing. But ultimately, he made the same choice again, choosing independence and raiding over alliance and cooperation. The results would be similarly disappointing, though Balon himself did not live to see the final outcome. Greyjoy's rebellion stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of living in the past, of allowing tradition to override strategic reality. It demonstrated that courage and cultural pride, while admirable, cannot substitute for actual power. The Ironborn fought bravely and suffered greatly, but bravery alone could not overcome their fundamental weaknesses. Small population, limited resources, geographic isolation, and military tactics suited to raiding rather than conventional warfare. Yet even in defeat, even stripped of their fleet and their dreams of independence, the Ironborn clung to symbols of their ancient power. Among the many strange and ancient things in Westeros, few are as mysterious as the Sea Stone Chair, the throne upon which the Lord of the Iron Islands sits. This seat, carved from a single massive block of oily black stone, seems to predate not just the current houses of the Iron Islands, but possibly human civilization itself in Westeros. Its existence raises questions that have no certain answers, hints at histories that have been forgotten. The Sea Stone Chair sits in the Castle of Pike, in the hall where the Greyjoys hold court. The stone from which it is carved is unlike any natural stone found in the Iron Islands, or indeed anywhere in Westeros. It is black, so black that it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface is smooth and slightly oily to the touch, cool regardless of the room's temperature. Some say it smells faintly of the sea even when far from water, though others claim they detect no scent at all. The chair is massive, carved as a single piece with no joints or seams. It depicts something like a kraken, though the carving is stylized and strange, not quite matching any real creature. Tentacles wrap around the back and sides, the arms are shaped like curling appendages, and the seat itself seems to be the creature's body. To sit in it is to be embraced by the kraken, held in tentacles of stone. No one knows who made the Sea Stone Chair or when. It was already ancient when the first men arrived in Westeros 12,000 years ago. Some legends claim it was crafted by the Deep Ones, the mythical fish people said to have lived in the oceans in the Dawn Age. Others attribute it to even older and stranger races. beings whose names have been forgotten and whose very existence is debatable. What makes the sea stone chair particularly intriguing is that it is not unique. The same oily black stone appears in other locations around the world, always in context that suggests great age. The base of the high tower in Old Town, the foundations of the structure that predates the current tower, is built from this black stone. On the Basilisk Isles, there is a toadstone made from the same material. In the Far East, the entire city of Asshai is built from this black stone, structures that seem to have grown from the bedrock rather than been constructed. This distribution suggests that whoever or whatever created these structures had a presence across the known world, or perhaps the world was different when these things were made. Some Meisters theorize that the black stone structures date to the Dawn Age, before the Long Night, when perhaps a great civilization spanned the world. Others dismiss this as fantasy, insisting the black stone is natural, that the similarities are coincidental. But the Ironborn have their own legends about the sea stone chair's origins, stories that mix history and mythology in ways that make truth difficult to discern. They speak of the Grey King, a legendary ruler said to have reigned for 1,000 years. The Grey King supposedly lived in a colossal hall made from the ribs of a sea dragon he had killed, married a mermaid, and fathered 100 sons who became the first lords of the Iron Islands. According to these legends, the Grey King's throne was made from the sea dragon's teeth, or perhaps by the mermaids at his command. When he died, the throne remained, outlasting countless dynasties, surviving when other relics crumbled. The sea stone chair might be this throne, though the stories have been told and retold so many times that their accuracy is impossible to verify. Some modern scholars, particularly among the Meisters, approach the question more scientifically. They note that the black stone could be some form of dense basalt or obsidian, formed through volcanic processes. They suggest the sea stone chair might have been carved thousands of years ago by skilled craftsmen, that there is no need to invoke mythical races or impossible legends. The fact that similar stone appears elsewhere simply means that this particular material was valued and traded widely in ancient times. But this explanation struggles with certain details. The scale of some black stone structures, like the entirety of Asshai, seems beyond the capabilities of Bronze Age civilization. The seamless carving of something as large as the sea stone chair from a single piece would be challenging even with modern tools. And the stone itself has properties that seem unusual, its oily surface and strange feel not quite matching known volcanic rocks. There are darker theories, whispered in texts banned by the Citadel, recorded by travelers who ventured to Asshai and returned changed. These sources speak of the black stone as having been shaped not by tools, but by magic, that it is somehow alive or at least reactive to magical forces. They claim that in Asshai, the black stone walls drink in sunlight and radiate subtle wrongness, that nothing natural grows near them, that animals avoid touching the stone when possible. If these claims have any truth, the sea stone chair becomes something more than a throne. It becomes an artifact of ancient sorcery, a thing of power sitting in the heart of Greyjoy power. Does it influence those who sit upon it? Balon Greyjoy's increasingly irrational commitment to the old way, his refusal to learn from defeat, could these be attributed to prolonged contact with the chair? Or is this superstitious nonsense, seeing magic where only old stone exists? The chair has witnessed the rise and fall of countless dynasties. House Hoare sat in it when they ruled the Iron Islands and the Riverlands. The Greyjoys have sat in it for centuries. Countless lords and kings forgotten by history placed themselves in its embrace and issued commands, made judgments, received petitioners. The stone has outlasted them all, unchanging and eternal. There is also the Kingsmoot to consider, the ancient tradition of choosing a new king when the previous one dies without clear succession. The Kingsmoot is held on Old Wick, specifically at a place called Naga's Hill, where massive stone ribs rise from the earth. These ribs are said to be the remains of Naga, the sea dragon killed by the Grey King. Meisters insist they are actually petrified weirwood trees, but the Ironborn maintain their own interpretation. The connection between the sea stone chair and these other ancient structures on the Iron Islands suggests a coordinated system, a civilization or culture that built across the archipelago. Perhaps the first men found these things already here when they arrived. Perhaps the children of the forest, who inhabited all of Westeros before humans, had some role in creating or modifying these structures. Or perhaps something even older was responsible. What we know for certain is limited. The sea stone chair exists, carved from mysterious black stone. Similar stone appears in ancient structures across the world. The Ironborn believe it is connected to their most ancient legends, and whoever sits in that chair claims authority over the Iron Islands, their rule legitimized by continuity with the deep past. The mysteries surrounding the sea stone chair will likely never be fully solved. Too much time has passed, too much knowledge lost. But the chair endures, sitting in its hall in Pike, waiting for the next lord or king to claim it. And in that endurance, in its complete indifference to the human concerns that swirl around it, the chair reminds us that the world is older and stranger than we often acknowledge, that beneath the surface of recorded history lie depths we can barely imagine. Those depths contain not just mysterious artifacts, but the legends of those who sat upon such thrones in ages past. Every culture has its heroes, those larger-than-life figures whose deeds echo through the centuries, whose names become synonymous with everything the culture values and aspires to. For the Ironborn, these heroes are not gentle poets or wise philosophers, but warriors and reavers, men who paid the iron price in blood and conquered through strength. Their legends blur the line between history and myth, between mortal achievement and divine intervention, creating a pantheon of exemplars that every Ironborn child grows up hearing about. At the very foundation of Ironborn legend stands the Grey King, a figure so ancient and so mythological that it becomes impossible to separate fact from fantasy. The Grey King is said to have ruled the Iron Islands for 1,000 years, an impossibility that Meisters attribute to multiple rulers using the same title or to simple exaggeration over millennia of retelling. But the Ironborn insist that the Grey King was a single individual, blessed or cursed with unnatural longevity. According to the legends, the Grey King was the first true Ironborn, the man who set the template for all who would follow. He did not merely raid from the sea, he ruled it. His great hall was not built from wood or stone, but from the ribs of a gigantic sea dragon called Naga, a creature of such immense size that her jaws could swallow entire longships. The Grey King hunted Naga for years, pursuing her across the oceans, until finally he slew her through cunning and courage. He claimed her bones as his throne room, ribs arching overhead like the beams of a cathedral. The Grey King's wife, according to the tales, was a mermaid, a creature of the sea itself. Their union produced 100 sons, who became the first lords of the Iron Islands, founding the great houses that would rule for generations. This genealogy explains why so many Ironborn houses claim descent from the Grey King, tracing their bloodlines back thousands of years to this semi-divine ancestor. But the Grey King's greatest deed, the one that truly set him apart, was his war against the Storm God. Legends tell that the Grey King was a champion of the drowned god, his chosen warrior in the eternal struggle against the storms that threatened Ironborn's ships. For 1,000 years he fought this cosmic battle, defeating the Storm God's attempts to destroy his people. When he finally died, the Grey King was welcomed to the drowned god's watery halls as the greatest hero who ever lived. Modern scholars approach these tales with appropriate skepticism. A 1,000-year reign is biologically impossible. Sea dragons large enough to build halls from their ribs would be visible to sailors across the known world if they still existed. Mermaids are creatures of legend with no verified sightings. Yet the legends persist, and on Old Wick, there are indeed massive stone formations that the Ironborn insist are Naga's bones. Meisters claim they are petrified weirwood trees, but the Ironborn know what they know. The Grey King represents the ideal Ironborn. Fearless, strong, favoured by the drowned, God, at home on the sea, able to defeat any enemy through prowess and cunning. Every great reaver who followed measured himself against this impossible standard, knowing he would fall short, but striving anyway. The Grey King is less a historical figure than an embodiment of Ironborn values, a symbol of everything they aspire to be. Following the Grey King's death, the Iron Islands entered what the legends call the Age of the Driftwood Kings, when leadership passed through King's Moots, with the assembled captains and lords choosing the best man to rule. This system, while chaotic, ensured that only the strongest and most capable could claim the kingship. Weak or foolish claimants would be shouted down or challenged to combat. This age ended with Euron Redhand, a figure who bridges legend and history, whose actions fundamentally altered Ironborn governance. Euron was present at a King's Moot on Old Wick, where the assembled lords and captains were choosing a new king. Rather than accept the democratic choice, Euron had brought his followers armed beneath their cloaks. At his signal, they drew weapons and slaughtered the other candidates and their supporters. The beach ran red with blood, bodies piled among the ancient stones, and when the killing stopped, no one dared challenge Euron's claim to the throne. Thus began House Greyron's rule, and the end of the old Kingsmoot tradition for thousands of years. Euron established hereditary succession, passing the crown to his sons, rather than allowing the Ironborn to choose their king. This was both pragmatic and tragic. It ended the chaos of constant succession disputes, but also removed one of the key features that had made Ironborn governance unique. The Kingsmoot had ensured that only capable leaders ruled. Hereditary succession meant weak sons could inherit power they had not earned. Euron Redhand is a controversial figure in Ironborn history. Some see him as a great king who brought stability and allowed House Greyron to build Ironborn power to unprecedented heights. Others view him as a traitor who murdered fellow Ironborn and corrupted the old traditions for personal gain. But all acknowledge his impact. After Euron, the Iron Islands changed, becoming more like the mainland kingdoms they had always despised. The legend of Euron teaches a different lesson than the Grey King's tale, where the Grey King showed that greatness came through heroic deeds and divine favor. Euron demonstrated that power often goes to the ruthless, to those willing to break sacred customs for advantage. His bloody coup succeeded not because the drowned god favored him, but because he was willing to do what others considered unthinkable. Among the great reavers of history, certain names stand out for their audacity and success. Dagon Greyjoy, who lived 3 generations before Balon, exemplified the Raider King. During the reign of weak Targaryen kings, when the 7 kingdoms were distracted by internal conflicts, Dagon launched devastating raids up and down the western coast. His longships struck as far south as the Arbor and as far north as Bear Island. He burned the Lannister fleet in Lannisport's harbour, a feat that echoed through history. Dagon was everything a reaver should be: bold, ruthless, successful. He paid the iron price for everything he possessed, taking ships and treasure and glory from those too weak to defend themselves. His reign was brief but brilliant, a demonstration that even in a world of dragons and organized kingdoms, the old way could still bring victory. When he died relatively young, his funeral was attended by lords from across the Iron Islands, all competing to tell stories of his greatest raids. But Dagon also demonstrated the limitations of even the greatest reavers. For all his success, he could not hold what he took. His raids enriched the Iron Islands temporarily, but provoked responses that ultimately cost the Ironborn more than they gained. He could burn the sea Lannister fleet, but the Lannisters rebuilt and struck back. He could raid the north, but the north remembered and took vengeance. Dagon's legacy was glorious, but ultimately empty, proving that raiding alone could not build lasting power. Another legendary figure is Viken Greyjoy, who lived in the immediate aftermath of Aegon's conquest. When the Targaryens came to Westeros with their dragons, House Hoare ruled the Iron Islands and the Riverlands. King Harren the Black refused to submit and was burned alive in Harrenhal along with all his sons. The Iron Islands needed new leadership, and Aegon allowed them to choose. The King's Moot selected House Greyjoy, and Viken became the first Greyjoy Lord of the Iron Islands. Viken faced an impossible task, maintaining Ironborn pride and identity while submitting to Targaryen authority. He could not raid as his ancestors had, for that would provoke dragonfire. He could not claim independence, for the dragons made that suicidal. Instead, Viken built Ironborn power through careful politics, expanding trade and strengthening the island's internal economy. He was not the most glorious Greyjoy, but perhaps the wisest, understanding that survival sometimes requires compromise. The Ironborn have mixed feelings about Viken. He saved the islands from destruction and established the Greyjoy dynasty that still rules. But he also bent the knee, accepting vassalage to the Iron Throne. Every Greyjoy since has struggled with this dual legacy, the practical necessity of Viken's choice versus the shame of abandoning true independence. Then there are the reavers whose deeds became songs, men whose names are remembered even if the details of their lives have been lost to time. Harwin Hardhand, who conquered the Riverlands and united them with the Iron Islands, creating a kingdom that stretched from the sea to Harrenhal. His son Harren, whose ambition to build the greatest castle in Westeros led to his doom when dragons came. These Hoares represented Ironborn power at its peak, ruling not just islands but rich mainland territory. The tragedy of the Hoares is that their greatest achievement became their downfall. Harrenhal was meant to be impregnable, a fortress that could withstand any siege. Harren spent decades building it, using Riverland's resources and forced labor, creating a castle so massive that it dwarfed every other structure in Westeros. But stone walls meant nothing against dragonfire. In a single night, all of Harren's ambitions turned to ash, and House Hoare died with him. There are also the legendary captains, men who commanded single ships rather than kingdoms, but whose prowess made them immortal in song. The Red Kraken, who supposedly could navigate by the stars alone and never once got lost even in the thickest fog. The Stormbreaker, who sailed through a hurricane and emerged unscathed while every other ship in the fleet sank. The Shadow of the Evening, who raided so far east that he reached Yee and brought back treasures never before seen in Westeros. These captains represent a different kind of heroism than kings and warlords. They were masters of their craft, sailors whose skill with ships and navigation became legendary. Their stories emphasize competence and expertise, showing that greatness could come through perfecting the practical arts of seamanship as much as through conquest and combat. The Ironborn also remember their warriors, men who fought in single combat and never lost. The legends speak of Dalton Greyjoy, the Red Kraken, who fought during the Dance of the Dragons and carved out his own mini-empire. Empire during the chaos. He was 16 when he became Lord of the Iron Islands and immediately began raiding the western coast with a ferocity that terrified the mainlanders. He claimed to have fathered more than 24 children by different salt wives, each one a testament to his virility and success. Dalton's reign was short but spectacular. He died young, murdered by a salt wife. But in his brief time, he demonstrated what an Ironborn lord could achieve when mainland kingdoms were too busy fighting each other to defend their coasts. He became the template for aggressive young reavers, proof that youth and audacity could trump experience and caution. These legendary heroes serve multiple functions in Ironborn culture. They are examples to emulate, showing younger generations what greatness looks like. They are sources of pride, proof that the Ironborn have produced warriors and leaders worthy of respect. They are also impossible standards, figures so exceptional that no living person can match them, creating a sense of decline and loss. The problem with legendary heroes is that they make the present feel diminished. When every story emphasizes how great the ancestors were, it becomes difficult to value contemporary achievements. Young Ironborn grow up believing they are inferior to their forebears, that the days of glory are past, that they live in a lesser age. This creates a conservative culture that looks backward rather than forward, trying to recreate past glories rather than building new ones. Yet these legends also preserve cultural memory, keeping alive the skills and values that define the Ironborn. When a captain teaches his crew to navigate by the stars, he invokes the Red Kraken's example. When a warrior faces impossible odds, he remembers the Grey King fighting the Storm God. When a leader must make difficult choices, he considers what Viken Greyjoy would have done. The heroes provide a framework for understanding challenges and choosing responses. The legends are also flexible, adapting to changing needs. During periods when raiding was common, stories emphasized the reavers' violence and success. During peaceful times, the emphasis shifted to the hero's wisdom and leadership. The same legend can be told different ways, highlighting different virtues depending on what the culture needs to hear. This flexibility allows the legends to remain relevant across centuries of changing circumstances. In the end, these legendary Ironborn heroes are mirrors held up to the culture, reflecting its values, aspirations, and contradictions. They show the Ironborn at their best, courageous, skilled, uncompromising, successful. But they also reveal the culture's limitations, the glorification of violence, the inability to build rather than take, the backward-looking obsession with a past that may never have existed as the legends claim. The heroes inspire and constrain in equal measure, shaping Ironborn identity in ways both empowering and limiting. Yet heroes alone do not make a culture powerful. The legends of the Grey King and Uren Redhand might inspire, but it was ships that gave those legends substance. To speak of the Iron Islands without discussing their fleet in detail is to miss what makes them significant. The Iron Fleet is not merely a collection of ships, but the physical manifestation of Ironborn power, the tool that allows a poor archipelago to threaten rich kingdoms, the means by which the islands punch far above their weight. The history of the Iron Fleet is the history of the Iron Islands itself, told through wood and sail, and the blood of those who crewed these vessels. The origins of Ironborn naval power stretch back into the mists of prehistory, to the age of heroes when the first men settled the islands. Those earliest ships were simple affairs, hollowed logs or skin-covered frames, sufficient for fishing the coastal waters, but inadequate for the raiding that would come to define Ironborn culture. The transition from simple fishing boats to true longships happened gradually over centuries, driven by necessity and refined through experience. By the time of the Grey King's legendary reign, the Ironborn had developed recognizable longships. These vessels were clinker-built, with overlapping planks providing flexibility and strength. They were rowed and sailed, allowing operation in various wind conditions. Most importantly, they could beach themselves, running up onto shore to disgorge warriors directly, rather than needing to anchor offshore. This capability made hit-and-run raiding practical, transforming the Ironborn from coastal fishermen into reavers who could strike anywhere a ship could reach. The Age of Heroes saw the Iron Fleet, though it was not yet called by that name, grow to dominance in western waters. Ironborn longships ranged up and down the coast, raiding settlements from the north to dawn. No coastal village was safe. The kingdoms of that era lacked organized navies, relying on local lords to defend their own shores. This fragmentation meant the Ironborn could strike where defenses were weakest, gathering plunder and captives before local forces could respond. During this period, certain technological innovations gave Ironborn ships advantages. They developed better techniques for treating wood, making their ships more resistant to rot in salt water. They refined their sail designs, improving speed and maneuverability. They learned to read the sea in ways that allowed navigation in conditions that would strand other vessels. Each generation of shipwrights built on the knowledge of their predecessors, gradually perfecting the longship design. The expansion under Harwin Hardhand marked the Iron Fleet's greatest period of power. When Harwin conquered the Riverlands, Ironborn ships controlled not just the western coast, but the rivers flowing into Ironborn Bay. Longships sailed up the rivers, striking deep into the mainland, bringing Riverland's lords to battle and eventually to submission. For a time, it seemed the Iron Fleet had become unstoppable, that Ironborn naval supremacy would translate to permanent conquest. But Harwin's conquest also revealed the fleet's limitations. Ships are excellent for raiding and for controlling coasts, but they cannot hold territory. Once Ironborn warriors disembarked to occupy Riverland's castles, they became vulnerable to land-based counterattacks. The fleet could supply and reinforce these garrisons, but it could not be everywhere simultaneously. The Riverlands remained restive under Ironborn rule, requiring constant military presence that stretched the island's limited manpower. Harren the Black inherited a powerful iron fleet from his father, but made a critical strategic error. He focused on building Harrenhal, the greatest castle in Westeros, neglecting the fleet that had made his kingdom possible. Ships require constant maintenance and replacement. Wood rots, especially in salt water. A fleet not actively maintained will deteriorate within years. By the time Aegon's conquest began, the Iron Fleet was probably weaker than it had been under Harwin. Some ships rotted, others poorly maintained. The overall number reduced through attrition. When dragons came, the Iron Fleet proved useless. Ships are floating pyres waiting for dragonfire. A single dragon could destroy dozens of ships in minutes, burning them to the waterline faster than crews could escape. The conquest of the Iron Islands was accomplished primarily through dragonfire destroying the fleet at anchor. Without ships, the Ironborn could not raid, could not supply their castles, could not even flee. They were trapped on their islands and forced to submit. The centuries following Aegon's conquest saw the Iron Fleet diminish. The Iron Throne forbade the massive raiding that had sustained the islands. While some raiding continued, it was small-scale and illegal, always risking royal punishment. The Greyjoys maintained a fleet for fishing, local defense, and occasional authorized military service to the crown, but it was a shadow of what had existed before. The shipbuilding traditions persisted, passed from master shipwright to apprentice, but without the constant demand for new ships, the craft slowly atrophied. During the Dance of the Dragons, the civil war that tore House Targaryen apart, the Iron Fleet saw renewed action under Dalton Greyjoy, the Red Kraken. Both sides in the civil war were desperate for ships and warriors, willing to overlook previous restrictions on Ironborn raiding in exchange for support. Dalton sided with Rhaenyra Targaryen, and in return, he received essentially free rein to raid the western coast. Dalton expanded the Iron Fleet rapidly, building new ships and seizing others from coastal settlements. At its peak, his fleet numbered hundreds of ships, not all of them traditional Ironborn longships, but also captured merchant vessels converted to military use. This mongrel fleet lacked the uniformity of a professional navy, but it made up for that in numbers and the ferocity of its crews. Dalton's reavers struck the Westerlands repeatedly, burning Lannister ships and sacking coastal towns, but the expansion was unsustainable. When the dance ended and Aegon III took the throne, the Iron Fleet faced royal retribution. Many ships were confiscated or destroyed. Dalton himself was murdered, and his successors were forced to drastically reduce the fleet size. The brief resurgence ended, and the Iron Fleet returned to its diminished state. The next several generations saw gradual decay. Without large-scale raiding to sustain the economy, the Iron Islands could not afford to maintain a massive fleet. Ships became primarily fishing vessels, with a smaller core of military longships maintained for defense and royal service when required. The great shipyards fell silent or turned to building merchant vessels. The traditions of naval warfare were preserved in songs and stories, but not in active practice. Then came Balon Greyjoy's determination to restore the old way, and with it came a systematic rebuilding of the Iron Fleet. Balon understood that Ironborn power rested on ships. Without a fleet, the islands were impotent, unable to raid or defend themselves effectively. He spent years rebuilding, commissioning new longships, repairing old ones, training crews in the old ways of naval combat that had been allowed to lapse. By the time of Greyjoy's rebellion, Balon had assembled a formidable fleet, numbering in the hundreds of ships. This was not the mongrel collection that Dalton Greyjoy had commanded, but a proper navy of purpose-built warships, crewed by men trained specifically for combat. The fleet represented a tremendous investment of the island's limited resources, timber purchased or stolen from the mainland, skilled shipwrights brought back from retirement, years of planning and preparation. The rebellion's naval battle demonstrated both the fleet's strengths and fatal weaknesses. Ironborn longships excelled at raiding and hit-and-run tactics, but in a direct fleet engagement against the Royal Navy's war galleys, they were outmatched. The war galleys had higher sides for archers, rams for sinking enemy ships, more robust construction that could withstand damage. The longships were faster and more maneuverable, but in close combat, these advantages meant little. The destruction of the Iron Fleet during Greyjoy's rebellion was catastrophic. Dozens of ships were burned or sunk. Others were captured and added to the Royal Navy. The survivors limped back to the Iron Islands, damaged and demoralized. Balon had spent years building this fleet, and it was destroyed in a day, demonstrating painfully that naval warfare had evolved beyond the traditional Ironborn approach. But Balon rebuilt again. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Iron Fleet's history, its resilience. Despite repeated destructions, despite economic hardship, despite every practical reason to accept that the age of Ironborn naval power was over, the fleet was rebuilt. Balon spent the years after his rebellion quietly building ships, slowly accumulating the naval strength that would allow him to strike again during the War of the Five Kings. This second rebuilding incorporated some lessons from the rebellion. Balon commissioned more war galleys in addition to traditional longships, trying to match the mainland kingdom's ship designs. These galleys were still crewed by Ironborn and retained some traditional features, but they represented an acknowledgement that pure longship tactics were insufficient against modern navies. The blend of old and new reflected the broader tension in Ironborn culture between tradition and adaptation. The Iron Fleet also developed specialized vessels beyond combat ships. Scout ships, smaller and faster than longships, ranged ahead of the main fleet gathering intelligence. Transport ships, broader and more stable than warships, carried supplies and troops. Even fishing boats were designed with the military considerations, capable of quick conversion to military use if needed. The fleet became a complex system, rather than a simple collection of identical ships. Naval tactics evolved as well. The traditional Ironborn approach was straightforward. Close with the enemy, board, fight hand to hand. This remained effective against merchant ships and fishing boats, but was suicide against prepared war galleys. Ironborn captains developed more sophisticated approaches, using longship superior maneuverability to avoid direct engagement, while attacking from unexpected angles, using fire arrows and burning pitch to set enemy ships ablaze from distance, coordinating multiple ships to overwhelm isolated enemies. The incorporation of archers was a significant tactical evolution. Traditional Ironborn warfare emphasized melee combat, the axe and sword. Bows were seen as somewhat dishonorable, killing from distance rather than face to face. But naval combat made archery invaluable. Ships could exchange arrow fire while closing, weakening enemy crews before boarding. Ironborn captains who embraced archery gained significant advantages. though they faced criticism from traditionalists who saw this as abandoning the proper way to fight. The Iron Fleet's organization also became more sophisticated. Instead of independent captains raiding wherever they chose, the fleet operated with centralized command. Admirals coordinated movements, assigned targets, ensured that ships worked together rather than competing. This reduced efficiency in some ways. Captains who knew local waters could no longer operate on their own initiative, but improved the fleet's effectiveness in large-scale operations. Maintenance and logistics became increasingly important as the fleet grew. Every ship needed regular maintenance, hulls scraped and re-caulked, rigging replaced, sails mended, oars repaired. This required permanent shipyards with skilled craftsmen, stockpiles of timber and pitch and rope, organized supply chains to keep everything flowing. The Iron Islands' lack of timber meant constant importation from the mainland, requiring either trade or raids to acquire sufficient wood. Training crews became a systematic process rather than informal apprenticeship. Young men learned seamanship and combat together, drilled in rowing and sailing and boarding tactics. The most promising were selected for specialized roles: navigators who could read stars and currents, carpenters who could repair ships at sea, battle commanders who could coordinate boarding actions. This professionalization improved quality, but also changed the fleet's character, making it more like mainland navies and less traditionally Ironborn. The Iron Fleet's relationship with Ironborn identity remained complex and contradictory. On one hand, the fleet represented the old way, the means by which the Ironborn raided and paid the iron price. On the other hand, maintaining a modern fleet required exactly the kind of trade and systematic organization that the old way despised. Buying timber was paying the gold price, not the iron price. Organizing shipyards and supply chains was building and planning, not reaving and taking. This contradiction was never resolved, existing in tension throughout the fleet's history. Individual captains might steal timber in raids, maintaining the fiction that they paid the iron price. But the overall system required trade and money. The fleet could raid, but it needed peaceful commerce to exist. The Ironborn wanted to believe they were still living the old way, but the Iron Fleet's very existence proved they had already partially abandoned it. In the end, the Iron Fleet's history mirrors the Iron Islands' broader struggle between past and present, tradition and adaptation, identity and survival. The fleet evolved from simple fishing boats to sophisticated naval force, incorporating new technologies and tactics while trying to maintain traditional Ironborn character. It survived repeated destructions, rebuilt again and again through determination and sacrifice. But it never fully resolved the fundamental contradiction between what it was, a modern navy requiring trade and organization, and what it represented, the old way and Ironborn independence. That contradiction remains unresolved. The Iron Fleet simultaneously proof of Ironborn resilience and evidence of their necessary compromises with a world that has moved beyond the age of reavers. This tension between what the Ironborn are and what they wish to be extends beyond ships and naval power into every aspect of island life. As we approach the contemporary era in which the main narrative takes place, the Iron Islands face an existential crisis. The old way which sustained and defined their culture for thousands of years is dying. But what, if anything, can replace it? This question haunts every Ironborn leader, dividing houses and generations, offering no clear answers. the Old Way's decline began long before Greyjoy's rebellion, though that event dramatically accelerated the process. The fundamental problem is that the world changed while Ironborn culture did not. The scattered villages and weak kingdoms that the Ironborn raided for millennia no longer exist. In their place stand organized kingdoms with professional armies and powerful navies. The cost of raiding has increased while the potential gains have decreased. The unification of the Seven Kingdoms under the Targaryens was the first major blow. Suddenly, raiding the Westerlands meant antagonizing not just House Lannister, but the entire Iron Throne and its dragons. The Ironborn learned, through painful experience, that dragon fire could burn entire fleets and reduce castles to melted stone. The raids that had been the foundation of Ironborn economy and culture became suicidally dangerous. Some Ironborn adapted. They turned to fishing and trade, using their ships for commerce rather than raiding. They developed the limited agriculture their islands could support. They sent younger sons to become mercenaries on the mainland, earning gold through service rather than theft. These adaptations allowed the Iron Islands to survive economically, but they required abandoning the core principles of the Old Way. This created a deep cultural divide. Older Ironborn, raised on stories of the glory days, saw the new ways as betrayal and degradation. They insisted that the Old Way was not merely a survival strategy, but the essence of what it meant to be Ironborn. To abandon raiding was to become like the Greenlanders, soft and contemptible. Better to starve with honor than prosper through trade. Younger Ironborn, particularly those who had traveled or been educated, often saw things differently. They recognized that clinging to obsolete traditions was a path to destruction. The world had changed, and the Iron Islands needed to change with it, or be left behind. But this pragmatic view was difficult to articulate without seeming to reject their entire heritage. The religious dimension complicated everything. The drowned god and the Old Way were so intertwined that questioning one meant questioning the other. If raiding was wrong or impractical, did that mean the drowned god was wrong? If the Old Way led to defeat and suffering, what did that say about the faith that justified it? These were dangerous questions that few Ironborn wanted to confront directly. Some attempted synthesis, trying to preserve Ironborn identity while adapting to new realities. Asha Greyjoy represented this approach. She understood that the Old Way in its pure form was unsustainable, but she also valued Ironborn culture and wanted to preserve what was worth keeping. Her proposals during the Kingsmoot included both traditional elements, like building more ships, and progressive ideas, like developing trade relationships and ending practices like taking salt wives. But synthesis proved difficult to sell politically. The traditionalists saw any compromise as surrender. The progressives were too small in number and lacked political power. The vast middle ground of Ironborn, who wanted neither complete restoration of the Old Way nor full integration with the mainland, had no clear leadership or direction. The problem was also generational. Older lords, like Balon Greyjoy, had lived through the time when the Old Way was still practiced, when raids still happened and brought back plunder. For them, the Old Way was not just theory, but lived experience. They could remember when it worked, even if that memory was distorted by nostalgia and selective recollection. Younger Ironborn had only stories, no actual experience with successful large-scale raiding. The Old Way was mythology to them, idealized and abstracted. Geography continued to constrain options. The Iron Islands, simply do not have the resources to support their population through farming alone. Fishing helps but cannot fully sustain the islands. Some form of external economic relationship is necessary, whether through trade, raiding, mercenary service, or some combination. The question is not whether the Ironborn need the outside world, but on what terms that relationship will be structured. Political instability compounded the economic and cultural crises. The succession after Balon's death led to the King's Moot, which produced Euron Greyjoy as the new king. Euron represents an interesting fusion. He embraces some aspects of the old way, particularly raiding and conquest, but he also rejects its limitations. He brings foreign ideas, exotic magic, and ambitions that extend far beyond traditional Ironborn concerns. Whether this represents evolution or corruption of Ironborn culture depends on one's perspective. The religious establishment remained largely conservative, with the drowned men generally supporting traditional practices. But there were also subtle changes. Some priests began emphasizing different aspects of the faith, focusing more on the spiritual dimensions and less on the practical requirement for raiding. This created space for Ironborn, who wanted to maintain their faith while abandoning the old way's most destructive aspects. Women emerged as a potential force for change, though the culture remained deeply patriarchal. Asher Greyjoy's example showed that women could command ships and men, could participate in Ironborn warrior culture if they were strong enough. While she faced discrimination and doubt, she also earned genuine respect from many. Her presence opened possibilities that might have been unthinkable in previous generations. The thrall system also came under pressure, though more from external forces than internal reform. The mainland kingdoms officially opposed slavery, and maintaining the practice created diplomatic problems. Some Ironborn began freeing their thralls, converting them to paid servants, not out of moral conviction, but practical politics. But this gradual abandonment of slavery removed another pillar of traditional Ironborn society. Looking forward, several possible futures present themselves. One path leads to full integration into the Seven Kingdoms, with the Iron Islands becoming just another region, their distinctive culture gradually fading into memory. This path offers stability and economic development, but requires surrendering the core of Ironborn identity. Another path leads to continued resistance and rebellion, clinging to the old way even as it becomes increasingly unworkable. This path preserves cultural distinctiveness, but likely leads to repeated military defeats, economic decline, and eventual marginalization, or even destruction. A third path, more difficult, but potentially more rewarding, involves selective adaptation. This would mean preserving the elements of Ironborn culture that remain valuable, the seamanship and courage and fierce independence, while abandoning those practices that have become counterproductive. It would mean finding new ways to pay the iron price in a world where traditional raiding is impossible. But implementing this third path requires leadership that can navigate between tradition and change, that can honor the past while building a viable future. It requires convincing the Ironborn that they can evolve without betraying their ancestors, that their identity can endure even as their practices change. This is a challenging task, perhaps impossible given how deeply the old way is embedded in Ironborn consciousness. The Iron Islands stand at a crossroads, their future uncertain. They cannot return to the past, but they struggle to imagine an acceptable future. The old way is dying, but what birth will follow that death remains unclear. What is certain is that the next generation of Ironborn will face choices that will determine whether their culture survives in some recognizable form or disappears into the larger mass of Westerosi society. We have journeyed across the Iron Islands, from their windswept cliffs to their ancient mysteries, from the depths of their faith to the heights of their ambitions. We have explored a people defined by their harsh environment, shaped by thousands of years of raiding and resistance, clinging to traditions that the world around them has outgrown. The Ironborn are many things: fierce warriors, skilled sailors, devoted believers. But above all, they are survivors who have maintained their distinct identity despite countless reasons to abandon it. The Iron Islands teach us about the power and danger of tradition. The old way sustained the Ironborn for millennia, giving them purpose and identity when they had little else. But that same tradition became a trap, preventing adaptation when circumstances changed, leading them into doomed rebellions and perpetuating practices that served no purpose beyond symbolic continuity. The tension between honoring the past and surviving the present runs through every aspect of Ironborn life. Their story also reminds us that geography shapes culture in profound ways. The Iron Islands' poverty and isolation created the raiding culture that defined the Ironborn. Their access to the sea gave them power to strike beyond their resources. But that same geography limited them, ensuring they could raid but never truly conquer, could resist but never prevail. Understanding the Iron Islands means understanding how environment and culture reinforce each other. The drowned god's faith, with its emphasis on death by drowning as the path to paradise, its harsh rituals and uncompromising demands, perfectly reflects the people who worship him. It offers no comfort for the weak, no mercy for failure, only the promise that courage and strength will be rewarded in the life to come. Like the old way itself, this faith produces remarkable warriors, but offers little guidance for building a sustainable society. As we leave the Iron Islands, the fundamental question remains unanswered. Can the Ironborn find a way forward that preserves their identity, while acknowledging that the world has changed? Or will they cling to the old way until it destroys them, choosing glorious defeat over inglorious adaptation? Their future hangs in balance, dependent on choices not yet made, on whether this next generation can find the courage to change that their ancestors found in battle. The Iron Islands endure, as they have endured for thousands of years. The waves still crash against black cliffs. The drowned god still waits in his watery halls. The sea stone chair still sits in Pike, ancient and enigmatic. And the Ironborn, for all their struggles and defeats, remain unbowed. What is dead may never die, they say, but rises again, harder and stronger. Whether that promise applies to their culture as well as their individual souls, only time will tell. If you enjoyed this deep exploration of the Iron Islands and the Old Way, I would be deeply grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless other corners of this world waiting to be explored, mysteries to unravel, histories to examine. Together, we will continue our journey through the lore of ice and fire, uncovering the stories that make this world so rich and compelling. Until next time, may your voyages be safe, your sails full, and your courage never falter. The sea remembers, and so shall we.